What's going on, you guys? Welcome back to the SFS channel. My name's Gavin, and with Week 8 NFL action nearly in the books, it's time to look ahead to Week 9 and discuss some waiver wire pickups that you guys need to go after in your fantasy leagues so that you guys can secure some big wins next week. Before I get into today's episode, each and every single one of you guys needs to go down and hit the subscribe button to my channel and turn the bell on so you guys are notified whenever I come out with a new video. It's quick, it's simple, and it's free, and it really helps me out. It gets me closer to my eventual goal of being able to do some really cool stuff here on the channel, like giveaways and whatnot. I really want to give away some free draft guides for next season, so if you guys go down and hit the subscribe button, it really helps me help you guys out in return and give back to this awesome community that we've got started here on the channel. So without further ado, let's hit the intro and let's get into the football. Alright, so getting into things here, I've only got one quarterback on my waiver wire pickups list for this week, and it's Drew Lock, the Denver Broncos quarterback. He just had a really impressive game against the Los Angeles Chargers, who actually have a really solid defense. They've got good pass rushers. They've got a good secondary. They're very sound defensively, and Drew Lock had a really big day against them. He had 250 yards passing and 3 touchdowns, including a walk-off touchdown with 1 second remaining to KJ Hamler. It was a really impressive outing for Drew Lock. I was very pleased with what I had to see. Drew Lock looked poised, and without Courtland Sutton this year, he's honestly been very impressive. For a guy that lost his top target and a young quarterback who depends on that big body and that big frame, he looks great. He's able to get the ball to all kinds of different guys on that offense, and the Broncos look like their offense might be on the uptick here. So Drew Lock's a guy I would have in mind in deeper leagues, or if you're desperate for a quarterback. He's barely owned in any fantasy leagues this season, and Drew Lock is definitely a guy I would have on my radar this week. Like I said, only one quarterback in today's episode, so we're going to move right along into the running back segment of the waiver wire ads. My next guy up on the list is J.K. Dobbins, the Ravens running back, who just had one heck of a performance. The Ravens honestly looked better off in their running attack without Mark Ingram on the field. J.K. Dobbins was explosive. He was dominant. J.K. Dobbins, his line was 15 carries for 113 yards, 121 scrimmage yards if you add on his 8-yard catch, and he was fantastic this week. J.K. Dobbins looked like the guy that they had that first-round grade on coming into the season. Obviously, he fell to them in the second, but J.K. Dobbins is one heck of a talent, and if you guys can go pick him up, I think he's going to help out some teams in deeper leagues, especially if Mark Ingram misses more time. This stat line is especially impressive because the Ravens produced those numbers against the Steelers' run defense, which has been exceptional so far this season. They were still opportunistic and got after Lamar Jackson like I thought they would, but the Ravens were able to run all over them. The Ravens' offense was dominant this week. J.K. Dobbins was explosive, and he led the way for that group. J.K. Dobbins, in the meantime, while Mark Ingram is out, is a must-roster player for me in fantasy. I think that the backfield gets a little bit mushy again when Mark Ingram returns, but for the meantime, J.K. Dobbins is a guy that you should be safe and pick up on your teams. And for what it's worth, his teammate Gus Edwards is another must-add player in fantasy this week for as long as Mark Ingram is out. Gus Edwards, 16 carries, 87 yards, and a touchdown this week against the very solid Steelers front. I would say the combination of J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards without Ingram in the backfield looks to be a lot more fantasy relevant and productive. But once Ingram returns to the lineup, I think things will get a little bit cloudy again and very hard to interpret and analyze in terms of fantasy. This next guy up here kind of ruined my fantasy week in a couple leagues, and that's Nyheim Hines, the Colts running back. I was starting Jonathan Taylor in a couple leagues because on paper the Detroit Lions were a fantastic matchup for the Colts running attack, and then Jonathan Taylor got out there and just couldn't run the ball. I don't know why. He just wasn't effective at all, and he wasn't able to get anything on the ground. And then Nyheim Hines has been very explosive this season, and he caught 3 passes for 54 yards and 2 touchdowns for the Colts. He was a spark plug for that offense, and Nyheim Hines is a guy who in deeper leagues, especially PPR, I'm picking up off the waiver wires this week because he's a guy that I think if you have a desperate need for a flex player, he's a guy that can go out there and produce for you. I think Nyheim Hines' rushing value is a little bit limited. They don't really hand the football off to him that much, but in terms of receiving value, I think in deeper leagues, if you're in a 12, a 14-man league, or even a 2-flex league, Nyheim Hines is a guy you should be targeting this week. I think that receiving value is too good to pass on, and he's a guy that I really like in those deeper leagues, as I said. Damien Harris is a guy that I had on my radar earlier in the season as a potential breakout candidate, and he had a really nice game against the Broncos, I believe it was, where he went over 100 yards and had a touchdown, and then he kind of disappeared for a couple weeks. I believe he went back on the injury report, and this week against a very sound Bills front and a team that's very good against the run, Damien Harris was dominant up front this week. Damien Harris, 16 carries, 102 yards, and a touchdown. He looks like the definite and clear-cut RB1 on the Patriots roster. He looks like the featured back in that system, and I think when he's healthy, he's going to benefit from the majority shares in that offense. Damien Harris, I would say, for me, is definitely more of a standard than a PPR play. He's a guy that's going to get the rock a lot of times, but he's not really involved in the passing game as they leave that work to James White and Rex Burkhead. But I would say Damien Harris has clearly surpassed Sony Michel in that offense for actual rushing value. I think Damien Harris is the best back in that offense and the back to own for the Pats this season. Damien Harris, a guy who's only owned in 30% of ESPN fantasy leagues, is a must-own in standard formats, and in deeper PPR formats, he's a must-add player as well. This next guy was a bit of a surprise for me, but a guy that I was really excited about coming into this season and I thought could have a lot of fantasy value, and that's Zack Moss, who had 14 carries for 81 yards and 2 touchdowns against the Patriots this week. Zack Moss is a guy who popped off the screen this week, and Devin Singletary did as well. Both of them had, I believe, around 13 to 14 carries and 80-plus yards rushing. So Zack Moss was a guy last week who I said Devin Singletary owners needed to add in case there was a bit of a flip in the script for who was the lead back in that offense. But I think now they're truly kind of fitting into the mold of what we expected, and that's a two-way RB by committee where they equally split the touches between the two of them, and they're both highly effective. I think the Bills have been kind of neglecting the run game, and that's what's been holding that offense back a little bit. So now that Zack Moss and Devin Singletary are getting their carries, I think these are two guys you need to target in your fantasy leagues. And Zack Moss, just like Damien Harris was, is a must-add in standard formats, a guy that you can feel comfortable flexing week to week because of that touchdown value that he gets on the goal line, along with the fact that he's just a good runner of the ball. So Zack Moss, another guy I'm going out and getting this week. Now into my wide receiver section of my Week 9 waiver wire ads video. Curtis Samuel is at the top of the list for me this week. Samuel got done both on the ground and through the air against the Falcons on Thursday night. He really popped off my screen, and he actually had that rushing touchdown when Mike Davis, I think he got his helmet popped off, and Curtis Samuel came in and ran right up the middle for, I believe it was like a 15-plus yard touchdown run. It was really impressive, and Curtis Samuel looked great. He flashed versatility and showed that he can get it done all over the field. He's starting to show a connection with his new quarterback, Teddy Bridgewater, and I think that he's going to be trending upwards the rest of the season. I think that all three of those wide receivers in the Carolina offense have some sort of fantasy relevancy the rest of the year. DJ Moore, obviously an elite talent. Robbie Anderson has been getting so many targets and been very productive this season. And now I think Curtis Samuel adds another layer into that offense. I think Curtis Samuel definitely owns some flex level consideration in PPR formats. I think that even his rushing value gives him some standard league value as well. So Curtis Samuel, definitely a guy I'm targeting this week. I think that he's a guy who can give you some nice upside and some safety in the fact that he gets those rushing and receiving attempts. So Curtis Samuel, go pick him up. I think that he's going to do a nice job for your lineups the rest of the year. I think a lot of you guys will be surprised to see this guy on my waiver wire ads list this week, but Denzel Mims, the Jets rookie wide receiver, is the next guy up on the wide receiver board for me this week to add. Denzel Mims, I think, got off to a really slow start this season because he was kind of dealing with the injury bug. He landed on the IR for a little bit of time, and I think that as a rookie, it took him a while to get acclimated to this team. I saw some flashes this week that I thought were very surprising and very impressive against the Kansas City Chiefs. So moving forward, I think Denzel Mims is a guy who's going to consistently trend upwards the rest of the season, and I think that by playoff time, Denzel Mims might be a flex level player for your lineups, or even a wide receiver too for Sam Darnold. Denzel Mims is a guy some of you should be targeting this week, and I think he can provide some sneaky upside the rest of the season. Darnell Mooney is my next wide receiver to add in Week 9, and he's a guy who has just been a playmaker for the Bears offense. I think that he's clearly taken over that wide receiver 2 role on that team. I think he's overtaken Anthony Miller for that spot, and behind Allen Robinson, I think he's the clear-cut number 2 target for Nick Foles. He's just a guy who's been making plays for that team down the field, in the middle of the field. He's doing it all over the place. Darnell Mooney has been scoring touchdowns. Darnell Mooney has been making jump balls. He's been making contested catches. He's been really impressive so far, especially for a 5th-round pick. So 5 catches, 69 yards against the Saints this week, and a touchdown. Darnell Mooney is definitely a guy who I think holds fantasy value moving forward, and I think is a must-add in most leagues. I think Darnell Mooney is a fantastic stream option, especially against good matchups, so he's definitely a guy I'm looking to add on my team. Corey Davis is a guy who I had on my list last week, but still only owned in 35% of ESPN fantasy leagues. Corey Davis has 3 touchdowns in 6 games played this year. He missed 2 contests because he was on the COVID reserve list, so Corey Davis, though, when he's been on the field, has been fantastic. Corey Davis has had back-to-back really impressive performances, and I think he's a guy who, moving forward, is going to continue to find success in that Tennessee offense. Him and A.J. Brown complement each other perfectly. They make it so that neither of them can be double covered. Obviously, with Derrick Henry on that team, too, they have to stack the box. And for a former high first-round pick, Corey Davis is obviously talented enough to get the job done. He's a very productive wide receiver going forward, and I think he's a guy who really commands almost must-start territory at this point in the season. You need to have Corey Davis on your team, and if he's sitting on the waiver wires in your league, that is a mistake by everyone involved. My next guy up here is a bit of a deeper league stream type of player, but Hunter Renfrow is a guy who has proved that he is a very safe option for your fantasy lineups when you're in need of a starting wide receiver, whether it's due to injuries, bye weeks, or whatever. Hunter Renfrow, not exactly a guy who's going to put up crazy numbers for your team, but he gets a healthy amount of targets every week. He gets in the end zone here and there, and he's a guy who can rack up some sneaky yardage totals as well. So Hunter Renfrow, a deeper league stream for me, a guy I would roster if you're in need of a wide receiver. I think that he can provide some safe fantasy numbers for your team, and a guy that I would feel comfortable depending on down the stretch of the season if you're very desperate. A guy who looked to be a complete draft day whiff this year is Marvin Jones Jr., the Lions' number 2 wide receiver, and I was just about ready to hit the bail button on Marvin Jones until the last 2 weeks. He's had 2 consecutive games over 10 PPR points scoring, and this week he had 2 touchdowns against the Colts' stout defense. So Marvin Jones Jr. looks to have finally gotten on track. Marvin Jones Jr. is not highly owned in fantasy anymore, as a lot of owners dropped him and bailed on him. So if you guys have the opportunity, go on the waiver wire and snatch up Marvin Jones, stash him away on your bench, and wait and see if he can continue his production. If he can, I think he warrants some starting consideration moving forward against nice matchups. So Marvin Jones Jr., like I said, go pick him up. I think that he might have finally arrived onto the fantasy scene this year, and moving forward, he could be a very valuable asset to your team. Another guy I talked about last week, Brandon Aiyuk, the 49ers rookie receiver. He's a guy you have to go get on your teams. Brandon Aiyuk is owned in 60% of ESPN leagues, which is higher than the guys I normally put on this list. But Brandon Aiyuk is so productive right now while Deebo Samuel is out with a hamstring strain. I think that could be a couple more weeks before we see him in action again. So in the meantime, Brandon Aiyuk is going to put up really great numbers for the 49ers offense. He had a really nice day against Seattle. So I think Brandon Aiyuk moving forward with that rushing and receiving value is a very nice asset in your lineups. He's a guy I am definitely considering starting on a week-to-week basis. And especially, like I said, he's in that wide receiver 1 role on the team right now. Brandon Aiyuk is a must-add player, and he needs to be owned in closer to 80 to 85% of leagues opposed to the 60% that he's at right now. A guy who I'm really happy that has seemed to kind of found his groove with the Chargers offense is Mike Williams, and I think he's a guy who is immensely talented and has just been waiting for the opportunity to break out. He's a guy who's shown flashes of dominance throughout his career with the Chargers, and I think that he's just really lacked the quarterback to give him the opportunities. Keenan Allen has been the number 1 in that offense for years, and Mike Williams finally is getting the chance with Justin Herbert, who likes to throw the ball down the field. Mike Williams in the last 3 games has 3 touchdowns, and he has 2 games where he had 99 yards and 106 yards receiving with a touchdown in both performances. He had a bit of a dud in between those 2 games against the Jaguars, but I think Mike Williams has finally arrived. We've been waiting for this for years since he came in the league. The guy is a freak of nature. He's huge. He regularly wins jump balls, and he looks like an absolute beast when he's in one-on-one coverage. So Mike Williams, a guy I'm really excited about moving forward. I think he definitely deserves to be picked up. I would wait 1 more week maybe before you put him in your lineups, but I think Mike Williams is on the rise and a guy who I think can be really nice down the stretch this year. Now into my last segment of the waiver wire part of this video. I've only got 2 tight ends for you guys this week, but Robert Tonyan is a guy who needs to be added by fantasy owners. He was actually dropped by almost 20% of his owners last week, which is crazy. I was actually advocating to add Robert Tonyan onto your roster last week. He was on my waiver wire must-add list, and Robert Tonyan produced yet again, as I expected. I'm a Packer fan, so I watch every single one of their snaps, and Robert Tonyan, I've been saying this for a couple of weeks, is Aaron Rodgers' second most trusted target right now while Allen Lazard is off the field. Obviously, Devontae Adams is number 1, but Robert Tonyan is his second most targeted guy. He's his second most trusted guy. I guess you could consider Aaron Jones in that mix when he's on the field, but he hasn't played in 2 weeks. Robert Tonyan is the next guy Aaron Rodgers wants to throw the football to. Robert Tonyan, in a week where 20% of his owners dropped him, had a stat total of 5 catches for 79 yards, and that stat total should look a little bit more like 5 for 129 and a touchdown, because Robert Tonyan had a wide open pass roughly 20 yards downfield, and he had another 50 to run if he caught the ball in stride, but Aaron Rodgers led the ball too far, and Robert Tonyan had to lay out for the catch. There was no one to be seen in the area of Tonyan, but he caught the ball, fell down, and slid, and then by the time he got up and started running again, there was a guy who caught up to him, and he tackled him. So Robert Tonyan should have had a monster fantasy week this week, but he was limited because of a bad throw. Robert Tonyan is going to continue to be a feature part of this offense, and he's a guy you guys need to have on your fantasy teams. He's going to be highly productive, and I could honestly see Robert Tonyan being a league winner this year. The upside that he has and the volume he gets, along with the lack of leagues he's owned in, is going to provide some really nice upside for you guys. And if you guys can get your hands on him, Robert Tonyan is a guy you need to own. He's super good for your lineups the rest of the year. Now that my Robert Tonyan rant is over, it's time to get into my last guy on my waiver wire ads list for week 9, and that's Trey Burton, the Indianapolis Colts tight end. He's been a guy who, over the last 3 outings with the Colts, has been fantastic. I believe he has 3 or 4 touchdowns in his last 3 outings with the Colts. Clearly, when he's on the field, I know he's had some injury risks and some injury setbacks in his career, but Trey Burton, when he's on the field, is a guy Frank Reich wants to get the football to. He wants to involve him in that offense, and he wants him to be a feature part of that team. So Trey Burton's got 2 rushing touchdowns over that stretch. He's definitely a guy who's versatile and is going to be involved. So Trey Burton is a guy I'm going after this week. And I think that this year you guys are finding that the streaming option at tight end is a lot more effective than it's ever been in fantasy before. I think that offenses are involving the tight end position more and more in their offensive game plan, and that's clearly showing up in the stats for fantasy football. So something I think we're going to see carry over into next season, but I'll get into that a lot later on in the year, and I'll talk to you guys about that later. But now it's time to get into some recap that I've had from this past week of fantasy action. The first thing I want to touch on this week is that you guys should not be panicking on DJ Moore. I know he had a very disappointing outing against the Falcons that was looked at as a highly favorable matchup, and I even ranked him extremely high on my wide receiver rankings this week. But DJ Moore underperformed, but I'm here to tell you guys to be patient. He's going to be okay. I watched every play of that game, and DJ Moore was actually wide open almost the entire game. They were running underneath routes with him and crossers across the middle of the field, and DJ Moore was wide open. He had lots of room to work with, but Teddy Bridgewater just opted to go down the field to Robbie Anderson and Curtis Samuel, or he was flushed out of the pocket and forced to check down to Ian Thomas or Mike Davis. So DJ Moore is definitely still going to be a feature part of that offense. His 2 receptions that he did have were highly impressive. He threw a nasty stiff arm at a Falcons defensive back on his first catch, and his second catch was on 3rd and 17, I believe, and he just mossed the corner that was guarding him. So DJ Moore is a highly talented guy. He's going to keep producing for your teams this season. Just be patient with him. Don't panic, and he's going to be fine the rest of the year. Same team, different position, Mike Davis. Unfortunately, the ride of Mike Davis is over. CMC is going to come back next week, or at least that is what is to be expected. Mike Davis had a great time as the starter in the Panthers offense, but the value for him in your starting lineups is over, unfortunately. I think Mike Davis no longer holds any starting value, but I'm here to tell you guys, my advice to you is to hang on to Mike Davis, because if something were to happen to CMC, if he were to come back on the field and suffer another setback, or re-injure his ankle, if something were to happen to CMC, Mike Davis is a must-own player, and I would hate to see you guys drop him and then lose that value and have someone else benefit from Mike Davis in their lineups. So hang on to Mike Davis. He's no longer a starter for your team, but he still holds value as a handcuff, and therefore you guys should roster him. Another running back I want to talk about is DeAndre Swift, and just when I thought that the dust had settled and DeAndre Swift was finally going to be that productive fantasy player we were expecting this season, he has an absolute dud of a game against the Colts and has virtually no fantasy points. DeAndre Swift was minimally involved and didn't really get the football anywhere close to the amount of touches I expected. I expected that Swift would be a 10 to 12, an upside of maybe 15 touch per game guy, and Adrian Peterson handled the workload. Swift didn't really have anything positive in the rushing category, and then Kerryon Johnson actually came back in the lineup for like 1 or 2 plays and ended up scoring a touchdown. So a really weird week for the Lions, and now I'm starting to pull back and become cautious again in regards to Swift's fantasy production and value this season. He had my trust for a week there, and then he snatched it right back from me, and I'm back to questioning Swift in fantasy leagues. I think it's fair to be cautiously optimistic with Swift. He was a guy who was starting to creep into must-start RB2 territory for me, but now he's starting to slide back into that flex role for me. I just see that lack of volume and production this past week as being a big red flag, and it scares me off of him a little bit. So I'm going to be cautious with Swift next week, and I'm not starting him anywhere but my flex if I were to put him in my lineup. Sticking with running backs here, I'm putting Raheem Mostert up on my screen because this man is the only trustworthy face that you guys have to look at in regards to the 49ers backfield. In Mostert's absence, we thought we had a clear defined role of Jerick McKinnon being that guy for the team. He looked great coming back from his injury, and he looked really explosive. He looked like the guy who was going to carry the rock in Mostert's absence and be that savior for your fantasy team if you guys were able to get a hold of him after Mostert went down both times. But that backfield since has become an absolute disaster. There's so many guys getting touches back there, and they're all touchdown dependent. None of them are really getting true volume, and this past week, McKinnon had negative rushing yards but a touchdown, so he still produced. JaMycal Hasty had 12 carries for 29 yards, I believe, and a touchdown. So obviously he did absolutely nothing besides his touchdown production. And then Tevin Coleman was sprinkled in there a little bit as well. And it's just really hard to see a clear-cut favorite and a guy you should be starting in that backfield while Mostert is out, because when he's there, he's clearly the most productive guy. He's explosive, he's consistent, and he's really good in your fantasy lineups. But the rest of these guys are just kind of all meshing together, and their value is just becoming murky and unsustainable. It's becoming untrustworthy, and I think that in Mostert's absence, you guys should just try and avoid 49ers running backs. If you guys have them on your team, try and flip them for something. Try to get a deal done. But I'm just done trying to predict the 49ers backfield. This week they were saying that JaMycal Hasty was the guy if McKinnon wasn't able to go, and then McKinnon was able to go, and he didn't really produce, and they expected him to be that lead guy. So it's just a bit of a unfortunate situation. It's something that's really hard to read, and for that reason, I'm moving off of my 49ers running backs if I have the chance. I understand that these guys can be streaky, and sometimes they can produce insane numbers, but if you guys can snatch up a more secure spot in your lineup and a more consistent player, I absolutely advise you to go that route. All done talking about running backs now. The next guy I'm going to talk about is a tight end for the Tennessee Titans, and that, of course, is Johnu Smith. And he's a guy that I'm starting to get worried about in fantasy. Obviously, you guys know he got off to a white-hot start this season, and he was fantastic. He was putting up tight end 1 overall numbers for that team, and he looked like the favorite target of Ryan Tannehill, or at least one of them, and a clear breakout player in fantasy this season. But Johnu Smith, the last 3 games, has been anything less than desirable, and he has just been a fantasy disaster. I believe over the last 3 weeks, he's had less than 10 points in half PPR combined. Like, all 3 of his performances added together is less than 10 points. So obviously not what you guys are looking for in your lineups. I think Johnu Smith is starting to lose his dependability a little bit, and he's a guy I've hit the panic button on. I think that I'm looking for other options right now, and Johnu Smith is not a guy I trust going forward. I think there's definitely a world that exists where the Tennessee Titans get back into what they want to do, and that's running the football. They got into a big hole early this week, and I think that those tight end screens will start popping up again, and they will get guys involved. But for right now, Johnu Smith is definitely a shaky start in your fantasy lineups, and he's a guy that I'm very worried about moving forward. The last thing I wanted to bring up to you guys and talk about in today's video is Justin Jefferson and his value moving forward and what his production against the Green Bay Packers this week means for him the rest of the season. Justin Jefferson had a touch under 4 half PPR points in fantasy this week against the Packers, and I'm here to tell you that despite those numbers looking terrible, that is actually an encouraging sign for Justin Jefferson moving forward. For any Justin Jefferson owner out there, please do not sell him for less than he's worth right now. Obviously, his value took a bit of a hit this week, but it's something I would not be worried about, and here's why. Justin Jefferson was facing shadow coverage from Jair Alexander this week, and Jair Alexander hasn't allowed a catch in the month of October, and Justin Jefferson this week had 3 catches for 36 yards. That means that he did more against Jair Alexander, who has by far been the best corner in the league this year according to Pro Football Focus. Justin Jefferson did more on Jair Alexander than any wide receiver combined the entire month of October has done. Not one wide receiver has caught a single pass on Alexander this month, and that includes Calvin Ridley, Mike Evans, and Will Fuller. So Justin Jefferson, who caught 3 balls on him this week for 36 yards, definitely outproduced what he was expected, despite what your projections may have said. Obviously, ESPN is going to give a healthy amount of points to a guy like Jefferson, who's been phenomenal so far this season. But Jefferson outperformed all of them. He looks like a true number 1 wide receiver in that Vikings offense. And despite a really ugly week this week, I'm not panicking whatsoever on Justin Jefferson. I think he's going to be just fine, and he's going to be great for your lineups the rest of the season. With that, I'm going to conclude my Week 9 Waiver Wire ads video and my Week 8 recap. Thank you guys so much for watching and tuning into the channel, as well as your guys' continued support for the growing brand. So, thank you guys for watching. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Turn that bell on so you guys never miss an episode, and I'll see you guys tomorrow for my trade advice video. Peace out.